outcomes for patients with NMDA receptor encephalitis have not changed over the last decade. We need your help to refer newly diagnosed NMDA receptor encephalitis patients who may be eligible to participate in the NIH-sponsored Extinguish trial. The Extinguish trial is now enrolling new NMDA receptor encephalitis patients. To learn more, search Extinguish trial at clinicaltrials.gov or call the Extinguish hotline at 844-4-BRAIN-5.
This is Jose Merino, Editor-in-Chief of the Neurology family of journals. The Neurology podcast provides practical information to neurologists and other clinicians to help them provide better care for their patients. Thanks for listening and have a great week.
This is Jessica Ailani, and welcome to the Neurology podcast. In this episode, we will be discussing the article, Variation in Endpoints in FDA Medication Approvals, a review of acute and preventive migraine medications by Leigh Sharpless, Aaron Kesselheim, and colleagues. Welcome, Leigh and Aaron.
Hi, thank you for having us.
Yes, pleasure to be here.
So most clinicians don't spend a lot of time thinking about trial endpoints, but I think we really should. They make a really big difference in practice as we spend a lot of time trying to explain to our patients what their treatment options are. And in clinic, I know I spend a lot of time talking about option A versus option B and what the differences are, and act like we compare them in clinical trials all the time, which we definitely don't have comparative trials, especially in the world of migraine. So I think this study is really important just in the idea of looking at endpoints. And can we even examine trial A and trial B and make a comparison, especially if the endpoints are not the same? So Leigh, your study highlights how in migraine trials, endpoints can be very variable. Can you tell me a little bit about your trial design and the conclusions from your study?
We reviewed 16 novel FDA-approved medications from January 2001 until September 2022 for acute and preventative treatment of migraine. These drugs were supported by 45 pivotal trials, so those are the trials that manufacturers submit to the FDA to gain approval. And looking at these 45 pivotal trials for these 16 drugs, we found that migraine medication trial endpoints were inconsistent within the same indication, so that's episodic or chronic, within the same mechanistic class, and within the same route of administration. And these trials varied considerably between just simply different types, as well as the different times that patient data is collected for analysis, as well as between other nuances. And so we pretty much used a review of drugs at FDA, a database of sort of approval material related to medications, and we're able to find these differences.
I think you brought up a really great point. The endpoints are different and the time that is being looked at between trials is different too. And a point about this is episodic and chronic. You know, your episodic trials for prevention, for example, tend to be 3 to 6 months, where your chronic migraine trials are no more than 3 months. Aaron, why do you think this might be important in a clinical aspect? And how can the information you found really impact a clinician?
And that really was the reason why we did this work, is because when patients come to their clinician with migraine headaches and are looking for treatment options, a lot of clinicians may know that a drug is available and that the FDA has approved it for preventive care or for treatment of chronic migraines. But underneath the surface, there are a lot of differences between drugs, and it makes it very hard as a clinician to say, well, here's what drug A can offer you as opposed to what drug B can offer you, if the endpoints of the very trials that lead to FDA approval are different themselves. It makes it really hard for those drugs to be compared against each other so that patients can weigh the differences between the drugs, especially if those drugs cost a lot differently as well. And you can say, well, here's an old drug and here's a new drug, and the new drug is, hundreds or thousands of dollars a month. The old drug might be, just a couple of dollars a month. Here's what the new drug can offer you. In order to answer that question, you really have to know what the endpoints were of the trials. And if those endpoints are different, then you're almost comparing, a little bit of apples and oranges when you're trying to make those decisions with patients. And what we found was actually quite surprising, that they are quite variable. They change over time. and they can be defined in different ways. And that makes it challenging for physicians and patients to make treatment decisions.
A whole another layer to that is also insurance companies. I mean, when they're trying to make decisions about what should be on formulary and they're comparing apples to oranges, it's tough for them too, I think. They have not an idea of endpoints, variables that have changed over time and the reasons for the changes that have occurred over time. So Leigh, if we take all that you've learned from looking at these endpoints, do you think your team would be able to suggest or have thought about, by looking at all these studies, what would be better endpoints? For example, a preventive migraine therapy?
It is not necessarily addressed in the paper specifically, but if you must ask, I would say that the way that the acute drugs are using endpoints is that the acute drugs tend to have much more varied endpoints, and these variations are obvious. For example, mild to no pain at 2 hours versus sustained pain-free at 24 hours. Those are clearly different endpoints. But for the preventative drugs, it seems like they use a reasonably similar endpoint, which is change in mean monthly outcome from baseline. But as Erin was saying already, those differences in endpoints are actually very nuanced. And so change in mean monthly outcome from baseline might be different depending on when we collect patient data for comparison to baseline, whether that's the beginning of the trial, the end of the trial, or some indiscriminate point throughout the trial. Or the other difference here is what that outcome we're actually comparing to baseline is. Are we comparing the number of migraine days, headache days, migraine attacks, and the qualifications between headache and migraine and attacks versus days rely on very stringent criteria related to pain severity and duration and associated symptoms and so on. And so realistically, we would need to find a way to streamline both the timing and what the explicit outcome is. And so that being said, we would probably recommend data collection at the end of the clinical trial so that everybody's data is subject to the same statistical analysis. And also, we would probably recommend using the endpoint change in mean monthly migraine days from baseline, because this would be in line with the 2012 International Headache Society guidelines and is already being used by some, though not all, trials since 2018, such as atogepam or rimegepam or eptinezumab. So it's not completely that all drugs are beginning to use the same endpoint, though we are beginning to see a bit more consistency in recent years.
Yeah, I think you've made some excellent points, though I know not directly addressed by the paper. I think these were important points to hear. I do especially like the point about variables in time outcomes. Do you mind, Erin, if I ask you a little bit more about that? What kind of variables did you see in the trials? Acute, I can understand for acute treatment in migraine, often you're looking at a single attack, so you see how patients do after single treatment. Sometimes they're multi-treatment attack trials that are like the second trial done. But for prevention, I'm going to guess that's where you saw a lot of variability, where measures were looked at in the first month versus last 4 weeks versus week 1 through 12. Did you see a lot of that variability in your data? And how do you think that impacts the information presented?
I think we saw variability in the way that patients were first enrolled in the trials in terms of how they defined the severity of the migraines that they were having in order to get into the trial in the first place. And then we also saw variability in how the numbers of migraines that occurred during the trial were registered by the clinical investigators. And that's really important, as you mentioned, because when we try to decide which drugs are going to be covered by insurance or are going to be given a higher place on a formulary and so be easily available to patients, or when insurance companies are setting up step therapy programs to try to provide a course for which drugs we use first, the way that we do that is by trying to compare those drugs by looking at their studies. And drug companies don't run comparative trials against other brand name drugs. So what we're left with are these artificial ways of doing that by just comparing the trials and putting them next to each other. And the way that patients are enrolled in the trial differ, the way that they register their effect at the end of the trial differ. It makes it really hard to do that. These kinds of characteristics that we found are not unique to the world of headaches or migraine therapies. I think that this is something that you'd see across a lot of different drug development. So I don't want to give the impression that we thought that we would notice something different in headache medicines that we would in other medicines. But I think that the large number of treatments for headaches that have been approved over the last 2 decades provided a good opportunity for us to demonstrate this. And now what we're hoping to do is to look at other fields of medicine as well and see if we see something similar. And I think that we will.
I have noticed for a long time, not only in the field of migraine, but many of our areas have variations in endpoints. And this does have a lot of implication for clinical practice and how we discuss treatment options with our patients. So I really encourage you all to take a deeper look at this article. Just to remind you, this is Variation in Endpoints and FDA Medication Approvals, a review of acute and migraine preventive medications. It's just been published online in the Neurology Journal on July 12th, 2023. So go take a look. Thank you both.
This is Stacey Clardy, your podcast editor. Thank you for listening and for letting us join you on your commute, while you're exercising, or even while you're brushing your teeth. This has been another episode of the Neurology Podcast, your best source of practical, relevant, and timely information for neurologists, clinicians, and patients.